So having plotted the long run AS curve and the short run AS curve, here's a question for you to look at. Which of the following will result in the short run aggregate supply curve shifting to the left, but leaving the long run aggregate supply curve unchanged? Okay? So what is going to shift the short run but is not going to shift the long run? Now, remember that our long run aggregate supply curve, the position of this long run aggregate supply curve is determined by equilibrium in our labor market as well as our production function, where the position of that production function. So if my production function shifts up or down, my long run aggregate supply is going to shift to the left or to the right. Yes? If my labor supply shifts to the right or to the left, or my labor demand shifts to the right or to the left, my equilibrium level of employment is going to shift to the right or the left, which is going to shift my long run aggregate supply curve to the right or to the left. So anything that causes changes in these markets is going to cause a change in the long run aggregate supply. Okay? So with that in mind, let's take a look at these options. Do you want to do it by yourself, or should we just do it together? Okay, we can do it together. Option number 1, if gold mines close down because reserves are all depleted, what do you think? Is that something that's going to shift our long run aggregate supply curve? Long run. So our gold mines start closing down. Does that change long run aggregate? Remember, if our gold mines are closing down, our productive capacity is diminishing, right? It's decreasing. Okay? A decrease in our productive capacity is a shift in our production function, or maybe even in our labor market. In the South African context, almost definitely going to have labor market effects as well. So number 1, that's going to shift the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay? So which of the following will result in a short run shift, but not a long run shift? So not option 1. Option 2, new production processes speed up steel manufacturing. Okay, so steel manufacturing becomes more productive. Is that going to shift the long run? Yeah, it's probably going to shift the long run, which means that's not what we're looking for. There is an infrastructure grant which is used to repair roads. If we're repairing roads, is that likely to shift the long run supply curve? If we repair roads, is it likely to change our productivity? If our roads are in better condition, we can transport goods and services quicker and at less costs. We're certainly going to be able to produce more stuff. We're going to be more productive. Okay, this one's interesting. Number 4. There's frost, and the frost destroys the harvest of fruit. Okay, so you have a fruit farm, and its harvest gets destroyed because of frost. Short run? Okay, long run? Yeah, short run, I mean, definitely, we're not going to have produced as much because a whole bunch of it has been destroyed. Has it changed our productive capacity? No, I mean, unless it somehow damaged the actual fruit trees themselves or the fruit farms. But there's nothing to say that it destroyed the farms. So yeah, that would have a short run effect. There's nothing in that statement that says there's necessarily a long run effect, so we can be happy with that. Okay, number 5, there's an oil shock which results in an increase in the price of energy. So here, number 5 is a good discussion point. If we have an oil shock, so the price of oil goes up, does that change our productive capacity? In other words, does it change the long run let's say there's an oil shock and oil prices go down. Does that change our productive capacity? Does that increase our factories? Does that increase the amount of machinery we have? No. It changes the costs of producing, right? So it definitely has a short-run effect. Does it have a long-run effect? Not necessarily. What tends to happen with oil price shocks, though, is they can have long-run effects. They can have long-run effects. But, the price of oil changes all the time. And it doesn't mean that our long-run productivity changes all the time, right? So, number 5 is usually a short-run effect only. Can have a long-run effect, but it's not normally the case that there's a long-run effect, which would give us B, right? Yeah, that looks good. Unfortunately, there's also an option for 4 only, which, it's not ideal. Okay, everyone happy with those answers? Yes. Yes. Your supply will decrease, but it's a short-run thing. You get it? It doesn't change the productive capacity of your economy. It does. The fruit farm is still there. The laborers are still there. They just don't earn much money this harvest, and the farmer doesn't earn much money this harvest, right? Yeah, it is a kind of a subtle difference, but it's the most important difference of the whole distinction between the long and the short run. Okay? So a long run effect will also have a short run effect, but a short run effect doesn't necessarily mean there's a long run effect. Yes. 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 Now we're gonna see that we can have a short run change in this market and we can have a long run change. Well, we haven't shown that yet. Okay? But I will be showing it just now. Okay? Because remember, in the short run, if I add a short run supply curve here, okay, so if I've got a short run aggregate supply curve, I can move away from potential GDP. I can move to a point over here and I can move to a point over here. So I can produce more than potential and I can produce less than potential. Okay? So the question is, well, how do we move to one of those 2 points? And why does that not change potential? Okay? We haven't answered that yet, but we will. So let's first talk about aggregate demand a little bit, and then we'll come back to explaining why, for example, a change in the money wage shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve. We haven't spoken in detail about it, and we will come back to it. But before we do, I want to discuss aggregate demand, so we can bring aggregate demand and aggregate supply together. Once I've done that, it'll be easier for me to explain how a change in the money wage shifts our aggregate supply curve in the short run. So aggregate demand, something we should at least be familiar with. The quantity of real GDP demanded is the total amount of goods and services produced in a country. And the amount that we're going to spend, the amount that we demand, depends on a bunch of different things. Obviously, the price level. So the price level is going to tell us that we have an aggregate demand curve that is downward sloping. There is an inverse relationship. I don't know why that D looks like a B, but there we go. Crumbs. Okay, price level. So the amount that we're going to spend depends on the price level. The higher the price level, the less real goods and services we want to buy. The lower the price level, the more real goods and services we want to buy. So the price level tells us about the inverse relationship. Our aggregate demand curve, however, can also shift to the right or to the left. What causes it to shift? A change in expectations, change in fiscal or monetary policy, and a change in the world economy. We'll look at each of those in turn. So aggregate demand curve, first of all, the higher the price level, the smaller the quantity of real GDP demanded. It's downward sloping. And we've derived that relationship twice already. We've shown that there was a wealth effect, and we've shown that there was a substitution effect. Okay? The wealth effect, because the change in prices changes the nominal value of your, changes the real value of your nominal holdings of wealth. And the substitution effect is when the interest rate changes cause you to shift spending from the present to the future, or from the future to the present. So aggregate demand, the relationship between the quantity of real GDP and price level. And for some reason in your notes here it says there's three, in these slides it says it slopes downward for 3 reasons. I don't know why it says that, because it's 2 reasons, which is exactly what your textbook says. It's 2 reasons. So, slopes downwards for 2 reasons: the wealth effect and the substitution effect. Okay? When the price level rises but other things remain the same, real wealth decreases because the nominal value of that real wealth decreases. So if you're holding your savings as cash, for example, when the price level goes up, the real purchasing power of your cash is less, which means your real savings have decreased. With a decrease in real savings, we spend less. Okay? It's like an anti-lotto win, really, right? Instead of winning the lottery, you've lost the lottery. You know? So you buy a ticket for 2 rand and then you lose and they tell you to pay 1,000 rand. Why don't they have lottos like that? Yeah. Okay, wealth effect, and then there's a substitution effect. When the price level rises, the interest rate tends to rise. When the interest rate goes up, what happens to investment spending or any interest-sensitive spending? Decreases. Right? So price level goes up, spending goes down. So we've got this inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Wealth effect we showed when we derived the aggregate demand curve from the aggregate expenditure model directly. Substitution effect we saw when we derived aggregate demand from the ISLM curve. If you can't remember, it's in the videos. You can go back and watch those. Or you can ask me, but we're not going to do it here. So why would our aggregate demand curve shift? What causes a change? There are 3 main things. Expectations. Okay, so in expectations, an increase in expected future income increases the amount of consumption that we want to consume today. We expect our income to go up in the future. We get a job, we're going to start that job in 1 month's time. We go and buy a new hi-fi today, we buy new clothes, new shoes. Sweet, I'll pay for it when I get my job, right? That's exactly what we do. Even when we don't want to. That's what we do. Okay? So an increase, a change in expectations can lead to a change in C. A change in C leads to a shift in the aggregate demand curve. Okay? Fiscal and monetary policy. Well, increase in government spending can shift our aggregate demand curve, right? Increase in government spending increases aggregate expenditure, shifts our IS curve, shifts our aggregate demand curve. Okay? You can trace all of those steps. Monetary policy. And what happens when the Reserve Bank, for example, increases money supply? Increase in money supply lowers the interest rate. Lower interest rate means more investment spending. More investment spending shifts the aggregate demand curve. Why is that different to what we explained here with the substitution effect? Okay? What matters is why did the interest rate change? Okay? If the price level goes up, and because the price level goes up, the interest rate changes, right? Price level goes up, therefore interest rate goes up, therefore investment spending goes down. Movement along the demand curve. Why is it a movement along? Because that decrease in investment was because of a change in prices. You with me? We changed the prices, that changed the interest rates, that change in interest rates changed investment spending. So we spent less, we spend less because the price changes. That's a movement along the curve. If the Reserve Bank comes along and just changes the money supply, so no change in prices, Reserve Bank changes money supply. When the Reserve Bank changes the money supply, that influences interest rates without changing price level yet. Right? Just change the interest rates. Because of a change in interest rates, at any given price level, our investment spending has now changed, which means it's a shift in the aggregate demand curve. You get it? The difference? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Okay, so monetary policy, it's a change in money supply, changing interest rates, which then changes investments. And in the world economy, what are we talking about? We're talking about exports and we're talking about imports. So what are the components of aggregate demand? They are the components of aggregate expenditure. C, I, G, X, M. We shift aggregate demand when we change any of the components of aggregate expenditure. C, I, G, X, or M. Expectations can change C, it can also change I, but normally we just worry about C. Fiscal policy, obviously changing G, and it can also change T. Obviously, taxes comes into consumption here. Monetary policy, changing M, which changes R, which then changes I. And our world economy, we have a change in exports and a change in imports. So two main influences that the world economy has on aggregate demand are the exchange rate and foreign income. So what will happen? I'll get to your question now. What tends to happen is when the exchange rate changes, the amount that we export and the amount that we import changes. So a change in the exchange rate changes exports and imports, and because a change in the exchange rate changes exports and imports, the change in exchange rate also affects aggregate demand. When we say foreign income, remember that when we talk about imports, we normally say that imports are a function of income, which means if our imports are a function of our income, our exports are a function of the income of foreign countries. You get it? So if the income in foreign countries goes up, our exports tend to go up. In the same way that when our income goes up, we tend to import more. You had a question? Yeah? Absolutely. What we're going to see when we deal with the monetary policy chapter, however, is once we'll put it this way. You see how we bring aggregate demand and aggregate supply together? When you shift aggregate demand, you move to a new point of equilibrium, which then does what to prices? Changes prices. Damn. Right? So yes, you're right. But we're going to see that afterwards, there will be a price effect. And then it just gets even more complicated, right? So, baby steps, we'll get there. Okay, so here's a question. Why does a fall in the price level increase the quantity of goods and services demanded? Why does a fall in the price level lead to a change in the quantity demanded. Okay, shall we go through the answers? Okay, so we said option A is incorrect. Are you happy that option A is incorrect? Because it's dealing with supply stuff, not demand stuff. Okay. Option B, consumers are relatively wealthier when the fall in the price level. Consumers are relatively wealthier. Yeah, okay, fine. And this shifts the aggregate demand curve. No, it doesn't shift. It's a movement along the curve, right? Option C, interest rates fall, and this stimulates demand for imported goods. No, we haven't dealt with exchange rates yet, but what would tend to happen is with a fall in our interest rates, it tends to make our economy, our exchange rate weaken, which makes us import less. Anyway, so we haven't got there, but no, it doesn't stimulate demand for imported goods. Wrong way around. Option D reminds me, in fact, that when we talk here, about the substitution effect, there are actually two different types of substitution effect. The one is the intertemporal substitution effect. The other one is, option D correct here, when our price level goes down, our goods relative to the price of goods elsewhere in the rest of the world, right, are cheaper, which means we tend to export more. So what is not described on this slide, where am I going with this? Here is that there are actually the substitution effect. When the interest rate rises, there are two. There's the intertemporal, and there's also the foreign, the international. Okay. Which makes D correct. Okay? That discussion is on page 637, if you want page reference. So now we can bring our short-run aggregate demand and our short-run aggregate supply together. Okay? And where those two curves intersect, we have the short-run equilibrium, where the aggregate demand curve and the short-run aggregate supply curve intersect. Short-run equilibrium. Okay? And if we bring our long-run aggregate supply curve into play as well, then where the short-run aggregate supply curve, short-run aggregate supply curve and the long-run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve, where all of those three intersect, we have a long-run equilibrium. Now, we can have a short-run equilibrium. For example, this point here, let's call it point A. Point A is a short-run equilibrium. Point B is a short-run equilibrium. But point A and point B are not long-run equilibriums. So we can have a long-run equilibrium that is not the same as the short-run equilibrium. Okay? So, let's understand now how we might arrive at point B. And having arrived at point B, noticing that that is not a long-run equilibrium point, let's say we started here at point C, and we moved to point B. Point C is a long-run equilibrium, because our long-run aggregate supply and our short-run, and we would have had an aggregate demand curve shift going through there initially. That would have been a long-run equilibrium point. Let's say there was a shift in aggregate demand. That shift in aggregate demand brought us to equilibrium, short-run equilibrium point B. The problem with point B is it's not a long-run equilibrium point. So what will tend to happen is our short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left and bring us to point D, which is a long-run equilibrium. Let's talk through those dynamics and how that happens. Remember, when the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts, that shifts when the change in the factors of when there's a change in the price of the factors of production, for example, the money wage rate. I can't guarantee that these diagrams are going to be neat, so we're going to draw them today, and then tomorrow when we recap, we'll draw them again, and they'll hopefully be a lot neater when we draw them the second time. Okay, my diagrams are not usually neat, I admit, but these are potentially going to be even less neat than usual. So we've got some long run, and we've got equilibrium, a long run equilibrium here, where we have the intersection of all of our curves. Now the important thing about this long run equilibrium, and let's call it Y star, is that long run equilibrium is a point of equilibrium in a lot of different markets and a lot of different diagrams. It's equilibrium in the money market, it's equilibrium in the goods market, it's equilibrium in the labor market. Okay? What we're going to focus on is just the labor market, but it is nevertheless equilibrium in a whole bunch of other markets as well. So in our labor market, we're going to have, so we're plotting real wage. And we've got some full employment level of employment, which we're going to call L star. And we got our production function giving us some level of output Y star. So Y star here and Y star here are the same values. Righty-ho. Now when we plot this diagram, the reason that we have a short run effect here, which is a movement away from the long run, is because we're kind of changing the way we think about economics, and we're going to move from classical economic thinking to Keynesian economic thinking. Okay, so there's a big paradigm shift here. Remember when we spoke about the aggregate expenditure model as well as the ISLM, both of them, when we first started speaking about those models, we said, let's just assume the price is fixed. Okay? Don't worry about changes in prices. When we got to the end of those models, we changed the prices, and then we saw that, things happen. Now, the classical story says the following. When I have an increase in aggregate demand, so my aggregate demand increases from AD0 to AD1. Okay? Classical demand says as soon as that happens, laborers go, hang on a minute, prices are increasing. We can see that prices are increasing. If prices everywhere else are increasing, what do you think we're going to do when we're working? Like, what does that mean for our wages? If prices are increasing, what happens to the real value of our nominal wages? It decreases, and we are not stupid, right? So why do we now want to work for less? Right? So if we see that the price level is going up, what do? We go to the boss and we say, sweet, pay us more, or I'm not working, right? So what classical economics says is people are rational. People make the right decisions about stuff. People can see what's happening around them. And when they see what's happening around them, they understand what's happening around them. So when they see that price level is going up because of an increase in demand, they know prices are going up because there's an increase in demand. And therefore, my real wage is going down if my nominal wage doesn't go up with my real wage, right? So the rational thing for those people to do straight away is to say, well, we're not going to work for the same nominal wage. We want higher wages, when wages go up, what happens to the costs of the factors of production? The wages are going up. It means your costs, remember labor is a factor of production. The cost of your factor of production is going up. So what happens to aggregate supply? It shifts to the left, right? In other words, to supply the same quantity of goods and services, you need a higher price level. So classical economics says as soon as aggregate demand shifts to the right, we have a shift to the left in aggregate supply. We move from AS0 to AS1. Okay? And we just kind of go from price level P0 to price level P1. Okay? And we don't change our output levels. There was an increase in aggregate demand, but there was a decrease in aggregate supply, and our output stays the same. Our production stays the same. Our employment stays the same. Cool. So, in the classical story, if we moved away from our initial equilibrium, I keep forgetting that red is black on the screen there. So it's not obvious to see that there is red and black here. Anyway. Disappointing. If I move from my initial equilibrium and I move towards, so let's say my initial equilibrium is point A. If I move from point A to point B, classical economics says that movement is going to be very, very, very temporary. Because laborers are soon going to go, hang on a minute, this is not right. Increase our wages. And we move from point B to point C. So this movement from A to B is temporary, and we move from B back to point C. Okay? So when we first introduced the aggregate expenditure model, and I said that we had this character called Keynes who came along in the 1930s, and he changed the way that the economics systems were analyzed, what he said was, this movement A to B to C, that's what the classical guys say. Okay? So any unemployment you have, for example, let's say that instead of moving from A to B to C, aggregate demand shifted to the left. If aggregate demand shifted to the left, if aggregate demand shifted to the left, the movement from A to B would be temporary, and then from B to C. So any unemployment in the classical story is temporary. It's not going to last very long. Don't worry about it. That's the classical story. In the 1930s, you have the Great Depression, and unemployment is lasting for not like, a couple of weeks, not a couple of months, but a couple of years. And Keynes' story as well, that's cool. But when you say this happens temporarily, right? How temporary is this, right? If you're saying that in the long run we get back to C, that's great. But, and here's his famous statement, in the long run we are all dead. So how long is this long run, right? How long do we take to get back to C, was his question. So what he was interested in understanding was, why do you move to a point like point B and stay there for a long time? Right? Why don't we just move straight back to C, which is what the classical economics said should happen? So what he said was the following, and we're running out of time. Let's take this wage level and this price level and call this price level P0, and the wage here, remember this is nominal wages, okay? W is nominal wages, W over P is real wages, right? So we've got P0, W0. So P0 applies to P0, okay? P0, P0, W0, L star, everything else is what we expect. What he said is the following. When prices change, right, there are a number of reasons why the nominal wage doesn't immediately adjust. For example, people often have labor contracts that are long-lasting, right? You agree to a wage for this year, and you cannot change that wage until you negotiate again at the end of that 1 year period of wage negotiations, which is why we always have COSATU and the other unions negotiating for wages. You know, it tends to happen about now, September, October-ish, right, every year. And those contracts then get set for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years sometimes, right, depending on what the negotiations are. So number one, wages don't adjust immediately because there's contracts that are not immediate, you know, subject to immediate change. Number two, when the price level changes, you don't know why the price level is changing. You don't have access to all information about everything that's happening in the economy. The only thing you see is, oh, some prices over there have changed. Then you go back to the shops and, oh, the prices over there have changed. But it's not like all the prices change at once, and they don't all change at the same time, right? And they don't all, you don't know why they're changing. Has the price of milk gone up today because there was some like dairy farm problem, right? And the change in the price of milk represents only a change in the price of milk? Or does the change in the price of milk represent a broader change where all prices are going up? It's not just milk, right? It's all the costs of production are going up. And because there's a lot of misinformation, change in the general price level doesn't necessarily translate immediately into change in the nominal wage. So what we have in a sense is a labor market that doesn't work exactly like we would expect it to work. How does it work? Okay, I'll leave you on that cliffhanger. We'll start tomorrow. How does it work then? Cool. If you're excited, good. If you got any questions, come down and we can just play out with the tune. I don't know what it's playing at the moment.